My wife became CEO after her dad died, you're fired 5 days later. Revenge, she never knew I owned 62% of the Co-See You Monday my lawyer, Grenfell. There's a special kind of coldness that chills you to the bone when you realize you're being erased, not by a stranger, but by your own family. And it all started the day I watched my wife accept congratulations for taking over the company, while her father's body was still warm. The air in that funeral home was thick with a strange mixture of raw grief and thinly veiled ambition. Outside, the autumn wind howled, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would tear my life apart. I stood there, a ghost in my own life, watching the handshakes, the whispered condolences that morphed seamlessly into congratulations. It was sickening. Sarah's new executive team formed a protective circle around her, their eyes flicking to me like I was some kind of threat. Me. The man who'd poured his soul into this company, working 70-hour weeks to keep it alive during the 2008 crisis, when everyone else was ready to file for bankruptcy. My wife, Sarah, in her sleek black Armani, played the grieving daughter perfectly for her father, David, even as she fielded questions about her strategic vision for the future. I watched her scan the crowd, that calculating look on her face, and her gaze just skipped over me. Like I was invisible. Like I didn't exist. Our son, Kevin, just 26, stood right beside her in his first real suit, nodding along to her every word like he'd suddenly become her chief advisor. And I remembered a time when that kid couldn't even balance his college checkbook without calling me for help. Then I saw her. My daughter, Jessica, across the room. Our eyes met, and in hers, I saw a flash of confusion, maybe concern. Like she was the only person in that entire reception hall who realized something was fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong with this picture. David had died on a Thursday morning, a massive heart attack at his desk. By Thursday afternoon, I'd noticed my email access getting weird. Certain folders suddenly flashed permission errors. Calendar invites for executive meetings bounced back with automated messages about organizational restructuring. Friday morning, I walked into the office, and my assistant, Lisa, looked at me with this horrible mixture of pity and awkwardness. When I asked her what was wrong, her voice barely a whisper, she told me she wasn't my assistant anymore. They'd reassigned her to Kevin that very morning. Lisa had been with me for 8 years. She knew my coffee order better than I did, helped me close deals, manage crises. And now she couldn't even meet my eyes, because someone had clearly told her I was already gone. I walked down the hallway to the executive wing, and that's when the little things started to pile up. Things that individually meant nothing, but together, painted a terrifyingly clear picture. My name was gone from the department distribution lists. Weekly strategy meetings had been rescheduled without me. People who used to greet me warmly suddenly got very busy, very interested in their phones, whenever I walked past. Saturday was the funeral. I watched Sarah work the room like a political candidate at a fundraiser, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while simultaneously introducing Kevin to board members as David's grandson and the future of the company. It hit me then, a punch to the gut. I'd been the one David called at 2 a.m. during the 2007 crisis when 3 of our biggest clients threatened to pull their contracts. I'd been the one who mortgaged my house, put my own money on the line when no bank would touch us. I'd been the one who personally flew to Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, to save relationships that everyone else had written off as dead. David used to introduce me at industry conferences as the man who saved his company. But apparently, that didn't count for much when DNA was involved. Sunday night, a text. Not even a phone call, just a text from Sarah, "We need to discuss your transition plan first thing Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp." I stared at that message, trying to figure out when my wife of 28 years had started communicating with me like I was some junior employee she'd never met before. Monday morning, I arrived at 7:30, like always. My keycard didn't work on the executive floor. It just kept beeping red at the security panel while the guard looked everywhere except at my face. My office looked exactly the same, but it felt like someone had already mentally cleared it out, just waiting for me to get the memo. When I logged into my computer, there it was, a calendar invite for 9 a.m., titled Organizational Transition Discussion, with Sarah, Kevin, and some HR person I'd never even heard of. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Sarah used corporate jargon to deliver devastating personal blows, talking about restructuring for operational efficiency, aligning leadership with family succession planning, and ensuring legacy preservation through direct bloodline management. I just sat there, thinking about how this woman used to cry on my shoulder about her father's impossible expectations. And now she was using his death as a weapon against me. Kevin wouldn't even look at me, just stared at his iPad like it contained the secrets of the universe. And the HR person, this nervous woman named Brenda, who'd literally started 3 weeks ago, kept apologizing while simultaneously pushing termination paperwork across the table. They were offering me 6 months severance. It sounds generous, until you realize I'd personally generated about $40 million in saved costs and new revenue over the past decade and a half. And Sarah actually said, "We think this is more than fair compensation for your contributions," with this bright, fake smile, like she was doing me some kind of favor. I signed the papers. What else was I going to do? As I walked back to my office to start packing, I passed the main conference room. Through the glass walls, I saw them. They were literally removing my chair from the table while I was still in the building. Kevin was directing the facilities guy where to take it, probably straight to storage or the dumpster. I felt sick watching my own son help erase me, like I'd never existed. Sarah stood at the head of the table, testing out David's old chair, that big leather executive throne he'd custom ordered from Italy. She spun around in it like a kid trying out a new toy. And I swear, I saw her smile. That evening, I drove past the office around 7 p.m. I'm apparently a glutton for punishment. Through the window, I watched Sarah pour herself a drink from David's private bar, the one with the 50-year-old scotch he'd been saving for retirement he never got to have. She was sitting in his chair, feet up on his desk, like she'd finally taken her rightful throne. And she raised her glass in this little private toast to herself, celebrating her victory over the man who'd actually built everything she was now claiming as her birthright. She didn't know that her father's office had a wall safe, hidden behind a picture of her childhood home, installed during the 2007 renovations when everything was falling apart and he needed to protect the most important documents. She didn't know that I was the only other person besides him who knew the combination. Or that he'd told me, "If anything ever happens to me, you'll need to open this," about 6 months before his heart gave out. She didn't know a lot of things, actually. And the emergency board meeting I was planning would be extremely educational for everyone involved. Monday evening, around 8 p.m., my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. When I answered, a voice said, "This is Thomas Reed. I was David's attorney, and I need you to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Something about the urgency in his tone made me agree immediately. Tuesday morning at 6:30, I walked into Thomas's downtown office. He was an old-school lawyer in his 70s, sitting at a mahogany conference table covered in file folders he'd clearly been organizing since David's death. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table, my name written on it in David's unmistakable handwriting. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 6 years ago, right after the company had finally stabilized from the 2008 crisis. David's first line read, "If you're reading this, I'm dead and Sarah has fired you, which means everything is going exactly as I feared it would." He explained that he'd watched his daughter become more concerned with status and control than actual business competence. He'd realized that the moment he died, she'd try to erase everyone who represented his actual legacy, instead of just his DNA. Thomas pulled out another folder, containing documents I'd barely thought about in years, investment papers from 2007, when the company was 72 hours from complete bankruptcy and David needed cash no bank would provide. I'd mortgaged my house, liquidated my retirement accounts, borrowed against everything I owned, and put in $2.3 million to keep the company alive. I remembered David insisting we structure it as equity rather than a loan. But at the time, I'd been so focused on survival that I hadn't paid attention to the legal details. Thomas showed me how that investment had been converted into preferred shares with specific voting rights and anti-dilution protections. Shares that had been placed in a protective trust, which activated under certain conditions, including termination without cause by a family member serving as CEO. But that was just the beginning. Thomas pulled out a third folder containing trust documents and corporate restructuring papers that David had systematically filed over 6 years, reorganizing the ownership structure in ways I'd never known about. Thomas did the math on a legal pad, adding up my direct ownership from the 2007 investment, my trust positions that had activated when Sarah fired me, and my protected share allocations that David had built into the corporate structure. The number he circled at the bottom was 62%. I just stared at that number, thinking it had to be wrong. But Thomas explained that David hadn't given me anything. I'd earned every single share through my investment and my work, and David had simply structured things legally to reflect that reality. The letter continued with David writing about how he'd watched Kevin grow up entitled and disconnected from real work, how he feared his family would treat the company like a trust fund instead of a living business that required constant skill and dedication. He wrote, "I'm not leaving my company to my bloodline. I'm protecting it for competence. And if Sarah fires you, it proves she values DNA over ability." Thomas explained that David had included Article 12, Section C, in the corporate bylaws, which allowed any shareholder holding more than 50% to call an extraordinary meeting with only 48 hours' notice. That meeting could vote on anything, including board composition and executive appointments. He'd already prepared all the paperwork, already sent registered letters to all board members that morning, notifying them of a meeting scheduled for Thursday at noon. He'd already submitted the ownership documentation to the corporate secretary, so there couldn't be any legal challenges. My phone started buzzing. I glanced down to see 17 missed calls from Sarah, 9 texts from Kevin ranging from confused to panicked, and 3 voicemails from the CFO, saying this couldn't be legal. Jessica had sent just one text, "Dad, I don't understand what's happening, but I believe in you." That message meant more to me than anything else. In that moment, Thomas told me that Sarah's attorneys had already called him twice, threatening lawsuits. But he'd calmly explained that every document was bulletproof, every filing was proper, and every share certificate was backed by solid corporate law precedent. He said Sarah was probably tearing through financial records right now, trying to understand how this was possible. And when she found the original 2007 investment documents, she'd realize exactly how much she didn't know about her father's business decisions. I asked Thomas why David had never told me about any of this, why he'd let me work for 17 years thinking I was just an employee. Thomas smiled the sad smile and said David wanted me focused on running the company rather than worrying about ownership politics. And he'd only wanted these protections to activate if the absolute worst happened. The worst, apparently, meant his daughter firing me 4 days after his funeral. That told me David had understood his own family better than I'd ever given him credit for. I left Thomas's office around 10 a.m. and spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday watching my phone blow up with increasingly desperate messages from Sarah, trying to sound reasonable while clearly panicking behind the corporate speak. The CFO, Daniel Miller, sent me the original 2007 documents with a message saying he'd found them in the archives, and now everything made sense, and he wanted to know if his job was safe under new management. Kevin left a voicemail that started angry and ended almost pleading, asking why I was doing this to the family. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. Thursday morning at 11:30, I put on my best suit, the one I wore when we closed the Atlanta deal that saved the company back in 2009. I drove to the office for what would be the most satisfying meeting of my entire career. I walked through the lobby and took the elevator to the executive floor. This time, when I pressed my key card to the reader, it beeped green. Thomas had made sure my access was restored under my new title as majority shareholder. I stood outside the conference room for a minute, watching through the glass as board members filed in, looking confused and nervous. Sarah sat at the head of the table, trying to project confidence while her hands shook slightly. Kevin kept checking his phone, like he was hoping for some last-minute miracle that would make this all go away. At exactly noon, I opened the door and walked in. Every single person in that room turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that might have been respect. And I realized that for the first time in my entire career at this company, I wasn't walking in as someone's employee, or someone's husband, or someone's father. I was walking in as the majority owner. And this meeting was going to be extremely educational for everyone involved. The trust administrator, an efficient woman named Eleanor Vance, stood at the front of the room with a projector showing the complete share breakdown. I watched Sarah's face go from red to white to this weird gray color. Eleanor methodically explained how my initial $2.3 million investment in 2007 had been structured as preferred shares, how those shares had been placed in a protective trust with specific triggering conditions, and how David had systematically restructured the ownership over 6 years to reflect what he called the actual value contribution of each stakeholder. Eleanor showed the paper trail, every filing with the Secretary of State, every corporate resolution that the board had approved without really reading carefully, every trust document that David's attorneys had prepared and stored in 3 separate secure locations. The total came to 62% ownership in my name. One of the board members, Robert Peterson, who'd been David's friend for 30 years, actually laughed in this shocked disbelief way and said, "David, you magnificent bastard," like he was talking to a ghost. And I think everyone in that room suddenly understood that this wasn't some hostile takeover. This was David's final lesson to his daughter about the difference between inheritance and competence. The vote to remove Sarah as CEO took about 3 minutes, and it was unanimous, except for Kevin, who abstained because even he realized that voting to keep his mother in power would just make him look worse. Sarah didn't cry or yell or make a scene. She just sat there, staring at the table like she was trying to find some loophole in the wood grain. When the vote was done, she stood up very slowly and walked out without saying a single word. Kevin followed her after giving me this look that was half anger and half something else. Maybe the first glimpse of understanding that actions actually have consequences. The CFO, Daniel Miller, who'd been with the company for 12 years, asked if he could speak privately. We went into the smaller conference room where he pulled out a folder he'd clearly been hiding until he knew which way the wind was blowing. He showed me financial irregularities he'd discovered over the past 6 months, expense reports that didn't match actual company spending, transfers from the pension fund to executive discretionary accounts, basically, a pattern of embezzlement that Sarah had apparently thought was her right as CEO. Daniel said he'd been documenting everything because something felt wrong, but he'd been too afraid of Sarah to bring it to anyone's attention while she had power. And now he was handing it over because he'd worked too hard on the pension fund to watch someone steal from people's retirement. The amounts weren't massive, maybe $300,000 total, but it was federal fraud when you touched pension money. Thomas immediately said we needed to report it and launch a full audit. I told Daniel he was keeping his job and actually getting promoted to VP of Finance, because the company needed people with integrity. The relief on his face was almost painful to watch. We spent the next week doing damage control, bringing in external auditors, notifying the appropriate authorities, and basically undoing 6 months of Sarah's leadership decisions that had prioritized image over substance. Kevin got fired 3 days later after we discovered he'd been approving expense reports without reviewing them, just rubber stamping whatever his mother put in front of him. When I told him he was being let go, he actually had the nerve to say I was destroying the family legacy. I looked at my son, this kid I'd raised and supported and tried to teach about responsibility. And I told him, character isn't inherited, it's built, and you chose to build yours on shortcuts and blind loyalty instead of competence and integrity. He left my office without responding, because what could he possibly say? Jessica came to see me that Friday evening. We sat in my office with the door closed while she asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I walked her through the whole story, from 2007 to now. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she told me that Sarah was moving out of the house, renting a condo downtown, and she wanted Jessica to choose sides. I told her she didn't have to choose anything, that this was business and legal consequences, even though we both knew that was partially a lie, because you can't truly separate business betrayal from personal betrayal when the business is family-owned. The story hit the business press about a week later. Some reporter got hold of the board meeting minutes and wrote this article about silent partnerships and posthumous corporate strategy. Suddenly my phone was full of LinkedIn messages and interview requests. Someone even turned it into a meme with the caption, "When you fire your father-in-law's business partner and find out he owns 62%. Sarah apparently deactivated all her social media accounts because she couldn't handle everyone knowing she'd been outmaneuvered by her dead father. The company's actually doing better now than it has in years. Revenues are up 18%. Employee morale improved because people appreciate leadership that focuses on results instead of politics. And we just landed 2 major contracts that Sarah's team had been bundling for months. I kept Sarah on as a minority shareholder because that's what David's documents specified. So, she still gets her dividends and still technically owns part of the family business, but she has 0 operational control and 0 voting power. And I think that bothers her more than losing the money would have. Sometimes late at night, I pour myself a drink from David's Scotch collection, the one Sarah thought she'd inherited, and I sit in his office, looking at the picture that hid the wall safe. And I think about how he spent 6 years building this elaborate protection system because he loved his company enough to save it from his own daughter. David didn't leave his business to his bloodline. He left it to competence. And that's probably the most valuable lesson anyone in this family could have learned, even if some of them had to learn it the hardest way possible. Jessica stopped by yesterday and told me she's applying for a junior analyst position in our finance department. She wants to earn her way up, like I did, rather than coast on the family name like Kevin tried to do. I looked at my daughter and saw something I hadn't seen in years, this genuine fire and ambition that had nothing to do with entitlement and everything to do with wanting to prove herself. And I realized that maybe David's lesson hadn't just been for Sarah. Maybe it had been for all of us. A reminder that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, one decision at a time. And the only thing that matters in the end is whether you built it with integrity or shortcuts, with competence or connections, with your own hands or someone else's work. Sarah will never understand that, and Kevin probably won't either. But Jessica gets it. And that gives me hope that maybe David's real legacy isn't the company or the shares or the legal documents. Maybe it's the lesson that character and competence matter more than bloodline. And that lesson is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. What do you think about this story? Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, please like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories.